The Third Reich demanded purity, sacrifice, and discipline, but its leaders lived surrounded by sexual privileges, occult practices, and relationships that contradicted everything they imposed on others. They didn't follow the rules, they designed them for others. While millions were indoctrinated to live without pleasure, brothels were organized for officers, extramarital reproduction was rewarded, and female prisoners were chosen according to personal preferences. What did the men who engineered the extermination hide in their private lives? How did sexual privileges function within the regime? Sex and repression, the hidden intimacy of the Third Reich. National Socialism transformed sexuality into an ideological battlefield. What in any society would belong to the private sphere became a matter of state in Nazi Germany, another dimension of the totalitarian control that sought to shape every aspect of human existence. This transformation was based on three pillars. First, the instrumentalization of the female body as a reproductive machine. Second, the brutal persecution of any sexual expression considered degenerate. And third, the application of eugenic theories that justified everything from forced sterilization to the creation of selective reproduction programs. The Nazi feminine ideal reduced women to their reproductive capacity. The slogan, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, defined the universe permitted for them, while separate education and visual propaganda reinforced this restrictive model. Simultaneously, while motherhood was exalted, a cult of the paradoxically desexualized body was constructed, glorified as a racial symbol but stripped of its pleasurable dimension. Non-normative sexuality faced systematic persecution. Particularly severe was the repression against male homosexuals, who were identified in concentration camps with the pink triangle and subjected to medical experiments intended to cure them. Unlike other contemporary dictatorships, such as Stalinism or Francoism, which tended to impose conservative sexual morality without profoundly altering traditional family structures, Nazism redesigned desire from its roots. It wasn't enough to discipline bodies. They had to be reprogrammed to serve the racial project. The regime didn't limit itself to censorship or the repression of pleasure. It turned sex into a device of state power. This process manifested itself in the obsessive cult of the Aryan body, muscular, fertile, harmonious, but surprisingly aseptic. Visual representations of the racial ideal in sculptures, posters, films, and parades promoted a virile aesthetic that exalted reproduction without eroticism. Nudity in Nazi art was frequent but never sexualized. The body was not an object of desire but of biological veneration. In this context, a structural contradiction emerged. While propaganda promoted an image of purity and self-control, in practice the regime encouraged extramarital reproduction in certain cases, permitted sexual relations in brothels controlled by soldiers, and displayed a double standard that tolerated and even encouraged sexual abuse in occupied territories. This approach responds to what several modern analysts call sexual biopolitics, a model of power that regulates bodies and sexuality not only to impose order, but to produce a population functional to the political project. In the Third Reich, this translated into the institutionalization of desire. Even pornography, officially prohibited, existed in closed circles of the party, used as a safety valve or tool of control over subordinates. In this architecture of control, the most revealing aspect was the contradiction between the public discourse of purity and the private practices of the leaders who implemented these policies. This introduction prepares us to examine these revealing fractures in the private lives of the leaders of the Third Reich, whose personal lives, far from exemplifying the ideals they imposed, exposed the same perversions, hypocrisies, and obsessions that characterized the regime as a whole. Some generals chose prisoners to serve in official residences as if they were part of the furniture. In the SS, certain commanders organized informal selections of young women for recreational functions before sending them to camps. In the Reich's brothels, there were lists of sexual preferences, and some girls were marked as favorites and reserved for high-ranking officials. Sex wasn't taboo, it was an allocated resource like food or ammunition, and those with the most power had access to bodies as part of their emotional wage. While Aryan laws prohibited embracing anyone unfit, the regime's most influential leaders abused actresses, secretaries, and nurses in rooms sealed by protocol. No one spoke, no one reported them. Some officers' campaign diaries feature phrases like, "the blonde from the hospital already educated." Not only soldiers traveled on the trains to the east, victims were also selected by name by men who spoke of genetics on the stage and demanded obedience between the sheets. Hitler, the Führer's celibacy and his forbidden obsession. The architect of the Third Reich publicly projected an image of almost monastic abstinence, dedicated exclusively to Germany's historical mission. This image contrasted dramatically with a private life marked by shady relationships, possible paraphilias, and a sexuality that various testimonies suggest was deeply problematic. The most disturbing relationship in Hitler's life was with his niece, Angela Maria Gelli-Raubal. When the 21-year-old moved into Hitler's Munich apartment in 1929, what was supposed to be a familiar arrangement transformed into an unhealthy bond of obsessive control. Hitler, then 40, supervised every aspect of her life. He reviewed her correspondence, restricted her movements, and forbade any relationships with other men. On September 18, 1931, Gelli was found dead in the apartment with a gunshot wound. The weapon belonged to Hitler. Although it was officially ruled a suicide, there was never an independent investigation. After this incident, Hitler fell into a deep depression, keeping Gelli's room untouched as a personal sanctuary and keeping her portraits in prominent places even years later when he was already Reich Chancellor. Otto Strasser, a former Nazi party member who later went into exile, claimed that Hitler's relationship with Gelli included atypical sexual practices, including alleged acts of coprophilia. Although these claims lack conclusive documentary evidence, they contributed to a disturbing psychosexual profile of the dictator. Parallel to Gelli's story, Hitler had begun a relationship with Eva Braun, then a 17-year-old photography assistant, in 1929. Unlike the public marriages of other Nazi leaders, Eva remained completely hidden, living as an invisible prisoner in Hitler's residences, especially the Alpine Berghof. The loneliness and public nullity of her existence led her to attempt suicide at least twice, in 1932 with her father's pistol and in 1935 with sleeping pills. It was not until April 29, 1945, hours before they both committed suicide in the Berlin bunker, that Hitler finally married her, formally sealing a relationship characterized by invisibility and female sacrifice. Hitler's sexuality has been the subject of intense scrutiny by historians, psychologists, and intelligence services. The Office of Strategic Services OSS report written by Walter Langer in 1943 attributed to him masochistic tendencies and unspecified sexual perversions. His personal physician, Theodor Morell, administered a pharmacological cocktail that included hormones and sexual stimulants, possibly to treat erectile dysfunction or sexual apathy. Details of Morell's treatments, preserved in partial medical notes, indicate the use of hormonal extracts derived from bull testicles, vitamin preparations of animal origin, and regular doses of methamphetamines. Some reports mention the use of testosterone and strychnine, suggesting desperate attempts to maintain a physical vitality that Hitler's body, ailing with chronic gastric problems and constant tremors, could no longer sustain on its own. One of the most controversial hypotheses raises the possibility of a repressed homosexuality. Historian Lothar Machtan defended this thesis in Hitler's Secret, 2001, analyzing his relationship with August Kubizek and his closeness to Rudolf Hess. Most historians, such as Ian Kershaw and Joachim Fest, reject this theory due to a lack of conclusive evidence. However, Machtan was not the only one to propose this interpretation. Soviet counterintelligence reports, especially those prepared by the NKVD for Stalin, also hinted at an ambiguous sexual life. In particular, they highlighted Hitler's close ties in the early years of the movement with young male figures, many of them members of the Sturmabteilung, SA, an organization that had notorious cases of homosexuality among its leadership until the 1934 purge. This context allows us to interpret the public myth of Hitler's chastity not as truth, but as a political strategy. During his rise to power, Hitler avoided any visible romantic ties to project an image of purity and exclusive devotion to the German people. In speeches and interviews, he presented himself as married to Germany, thus avoiding the suspicions of conservative voters and criticism from the foreign press. This narrative worked effectively as a propaganda device. While Goebbels fabricated images of the Führer as a paternal and mystical figure, his ties to Eva Braun were carefully concealed, and private letters were destroyed. The women around Hitler were rendered invisible, transformed into silent presences. The emotional repression among those around him was not accidental. It responded to a symbolic design in which the leader was to embody a higher will removed from common human desire. What is historically irrefutable is the paradox that the same regime that fiercely persecuted homosexuality was led by a man whose sexuality presented profound complexities and contradictions. Hitler promoted an ideal of Aryan purity that he himself, with his sickly body and alleged paraphilias, could not embody, creating a chasm between the Superman glorified in propaganda and the biological reality of the Führer himself. In this sense, Hitler's sexuality was not only a personal matter, but also an ideological device. His emotional repression served to hide physical weaknesses, channel internal frustrations, and reinforce the myth of the infallible leader. But beneath that image, unresolved tensions accumulated, relationships marked by control, sacrifice, and the emotional destruction of the women who approached him. Sexuality in the Third Reich was not homogeneous, but the Führer's own example demonstrated the cruelest rule. While the masses were forced to reproduce, surrender their bodies to the state, or die for the race, those who dictated these rules lived locked in their own universe of shadows, contradictions, and repressed desire. Himmler, the engineer of racial sex. The evolution of Heinrich Himmler's private life represents one of the most revealing metamorphoses within the Nazi elite. He went from extreme youthful puritanism to becoming the architect of a state system of selective reproduction, while simultaneously maintaining a double family life that contradicted his own public mandates. Born in 1900 to a Bavarian Catholic family, the young Himmler was a sickly, socially maladjusted, and sexually repressed boy. His youthful diaries reveal an aversion to physical contact and a view of sex as pollution of the soul. He considered masturbation a degenerative act that weakened the male will and championed chastity as a symbol of moral strength. Upon assuming leadership of the SS, Himmler brought these puritanical ideals to his elite organization. Members were required to practice premarital abstinence, maintain absolute fidelity, and choose racially appropriate partners. Celibacy, which he himself practiced well into his 30s, represented a form of emotional control and preservation of vital energy for service to the Reich. In 1928, he married Margarete Boden, a nurse 7 years his senior. Although they had a daughter, Gudrun, their relationship was characterized from the beginning by an almost administrative coldness. As his power grew, the distance between them increased. Margarete remained confined to the family residence in Gmünd, while Himmler organized the regime's repressive apparatus from Berlin. The break with his initial puritanism became apparent in 1936, when he hired 25-year-old Hedwig Potthast as his secretary. What began as a professional relationship soon transformed into a personal bond. By 1941, Hedwig had abandoned her official position and settled into a country house financed by Himmler. Together they had 2 children out of wedlock, Helga, born 1942, and Nanette, born 1944, registered under false surnames to keep the relationship secret. The contradiction was blatant. While he sent homosexuals to concentration camps and enacted laws against adultery, he himself maintained a double family life. The guardian of racial purity systematically violated the moral codes he imposed on his subordinates. But the greatest transformation in his view of sexuality materialized with the creation of the Lebensborn Source of Life program in December 1935. This institutionalized project aimed to increase birth rates among racially worthy people by supporting single mothers of Aryan origin and promoting sexual relations for eugenic purposes. Lebensborn facilities, established in various regions of the Reich and later in occupied countries, functioned as elite maternity wards where women selected along racial lines were paired with SS officers. Children born in these institutions were adopted by ideologically sympathetic families or raised directly by the Nazi state. During the war, the program took on more sinister dimensions. Thousands of children with Nordic characteristics were kidnapped from their families in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other occupied territories to be Germanized if they met established racial criteria. Himmler personally supervised the Lebensborn reports, signed authorizations for strategic adoptions, and required that women be evaluated not only for their genealogical origins, but also for their physical appearance, bone structure, eye color, and disciplined behavior. Women were seen as incubators of the Reich's future, recruited for a project that reduced them to biological matter. In Norway, where the program reached a significant scale, more than 12,000 children were born under Lebensborn. Relationships between German soldiers and local women were encouraged as long as the couples met racial criteria. These mothers were promised medical support, housing, and social protection in exchange for handing their children over to the Nazi state. Most were deceived. Many of them lost all contact with their children, were sent to Germany, or were interned in paramilitary institutions. The Lebensborn structure functioned as a parallel reproductive machinery. Clinics were decorated with Germanic symbols, women were subjected to rigorous medical examinations, and were prohibited from any behavior deemed distracting from their racial duty. Mothers were required to maintain emotional discipline. They were not to develop excessive attachment to their children, as many would be relocated to other regions. Himmler's transformation from a defender of celibacy to a promoter of institutionalized selective reproduction reveals the essence of the Nazi biopolitical project. Sexuality was no longer something to be repressed for moral reasons, but a biological resource to be systematically exploited for racial purposes. The human body, particularly the female body, became the property of the state and a tool for its demographic purposes. In internal speeches, Himmler explained that sexual pleasure should be subordinated to the collective interest. Reproduction, not desire, was the ultimate goal. Even within marriage, he encouraged SS members to conceive with other women if they were genetically useful. In his view, emotional fidelity was an obstacle to the expansion of Aryan blood. The Lebensborns were also a symbolic recruitment space. Mothers received medals and public awards. Nurses were chosen from among female members of National Socialist organizations. The facilities operated as temples of the race, where birth was a state ceremony. There, sex was no longer a private matter. Every pregnancy was a political act, every birth an ideological triumph. Himmler advocated that SS men should have at least 4 children, preferably with different women if necessary. His contempt for the traditional bourgeois family structure was absolute. He considered the nuclear family limited and sentimental, while the state should form an extended genetic network, free from emotional restrictions. After his capture by British forces in May 1945, Himmler committed suicide by biting into a cyanide capsule, thus avoiding justice for the mass crimes he had orchestrated. He never publicly acknowledged Hedwig or his illegitimate children, maintaining until the end the facade of an austere and morally upright civil servant, which his private life consistently contradicted. Gudrun Himmler, his legitimate daughter, defended her father's honor until the end of her life. Hedwig's children grew up under false identities, protected by former collaborators who fled to South America or Switzerland. Documents revealing the existence of these children were systematically hidden after the war by members of the SS's inner circle. Himmler's sexual life, repressed in his youth, reappeared distorted by ideology. What began as a mystical devotion to personal control was transformed into a reproductive apparatus that exploited women, children, and entire couples. Intimacy was devoured by the state, and the body, which he feared to touch in his youth, was turned into a cog in a genocidal machine. Goebbels, the Minister of Lust and Family Death. The Nazi Minister of Propaganda is perhaps the most transparent example of the use of political power to satisfy personal sexual desires while simultaneously exercising media control that allowed him to project the image of a model family while living a life of systematic infidelity and extreme emotional manipulation. Goebbels' physical complexes profoundly influenced his psychological development. His small stature and deformed leg, a consequence of childhood osteomyelitis, generated a profound sense of inferiority to the Aryan ideal he himself promoted. To compensate, he developed a seductive and manipulative nature, using his growing political power as a tool of conquest. His diaries, preserved and published after the war, reveal a compulsive obsession with quantifying his sexual conquests, describing in detail his seduction techniques and his victims' reactions. With his rise to the Ministry of Propaganda in 1933, he gained privileged access to actresses and personalities in the entertainment world through his control over the UFA, Germany's leading film production company. This access not only allowed him to influence the ideological content of films, but also to exert direct pressure on the careers of young women aspiring to act. Goebbels offered contracts, postponed censorship, or promoted filming in exchange for sexual favors. His office functioned as a mediating space between the entertainment industry and the power apparatus, where professional decisions were intertwined with his personal desires. Some actresses were used as decorative figures at public events, while others were housed in official residences and treated as cultural guests of the state. The line between propaganda and lust became increasingly blurred. In numerous diary entries, Goebbels noted physical impressions of newly met women as if they were erotic casting calls: light eyes, obedient, disciplined body. His most destructive affair was with Lida Barova, a glamorous Czech actress who had achieved popularity in Germany. They began a relationship in 1936 that soon became an obsession. Goebbels even contemplated leaving his family, writing in his diary, "I have found in Lida what I lack at home: youth, fire, total dedication." The contrast with his official family life could hardly have been more dramatic. In 1931, Joseph had married Magda Quandt, née Ritschl, the widow of a millionaire industrialist and mother of a son from her previous marriage. Hitler, who had known Magda before Goebbels, actively encouraged this union, envisioning them as the Reich's model family. In the public eye, the Goebbelses represented the perfect Nazi ideal: Aryan, prolific, they had 6 children, and seemingly devoted to the regime. But behind this propaganda facade, their marriage was a battlefield of mutual infidelity and psychological manipulation. Magda kept her own secrets, including possible affairs with other regime figures. Her position as the wife of the Minister of Propaganda made her a feminine emblem of the Reich. Photographed alongside Hitler, an exemplary mother in official magazines and an ambassador at charitable events, Magda embodied the National Socialist model of motherhood, although privately her life was marked by heartbreak, jealousy, and frustration. Hitler trusted his public image so much that he once said, "Magda is the friendly face of the Reich." Therefore, when the crisis with Barova erupted, the impact was not only personal but political. Magda came not only as a wounded wife, but as an institutional figure whose symbolic role was crumbling. The crisis erupted in 1938 when the affair with Barova reached scandalous proportions. Magda, publicly humiliated, went directly to Hitler demanding a solution. For the Führer, obsessed with the regime's public image, the Goebbels couple represented a propaganda symbol that he could not afford to destroy. Hitler intervened personally, summoning Goebbels to demand an immediate end to the relationship. He forbade him from seeing Barova again and ordered the actress's expulsion from Germany. When Goebbels begged permission to pursue a polygamous relationship, Hitler flatly rejected the proposal. The rejection caused Goebbels to go into a state of depression, from which he only emerged after receiving assurances that his political position was not in danger. This episode exposed Goebbels' emotional fragility. For weeks, he partially withdrew from public life, reduced his official activities, and wrote desperate letters to Hitler and Magda, alternating pleas for love with promises of party loyalty. For a man obsessed with his image, being publicly corrected by the Führer was a devastating humiliation. This episode revealed a little-discussed dimension of the Third Reich. Even the most intimate emotions and relationships were subject to political regulation. The bedroom was not a private space, but an extension of the ideological stage where the National Socialist narrative was to be played out. The most extraordinary aspect of this emotional triangle was Magda's fascination with Hitler, which was more intense than her affection for her own husband. Various accounts suggest that she maintained an almost religious devotion to the Führer, describing him in private correspondence as the only man capable of transforming the world. This fascination persisted even as her marriage disintegrated. Several biographers have speculated that Magda would have liked to be something more than Hitler's ideological collaborator. Her letters, which have only been partially preserved, reveal a reverential tone that transcends political admiration. She called him "my German son" and "the hope of our souls." Even when Goebbels fell into disgrace, Magda found solace in her emotional closeness to the Führer. This invisible tension within the Hitler-Magda-Goebbels triangle turned their marriage into a living representation of ideology. Passion sacrificed for the cause, emotions subordinated to discipline, desire policed by party morality. The end of the Goebbels couple would epitomize the ideological perversion of Nazism. In April 1945, sheltering in the Berlin bunker with Hitler, they made the most horrific decision imaginable after the Führer's suicide. They murdered their 6 children, first administering morphine to sedate them and then cyanide. They then committed suicide together. In a letter written hours earlier, Magda justified the infanticide by saying, "I cannot imagine life without National Socialism. Children are too good for the world that will come after." This final act represented the logical culmination of an ideology that had completely subordinated basic human bonds, even maternal love, to absolute political loyalty. The act was meticulous. Magda dressed the children in Sunday clothes, combed their hair, and put them to bed. She ordered silence in the bunker's corridors. The morphine ampoules were injected by the SS doctor. Then, with the help of Ludwig Stumpfegger, they placed the cyanide capsules between the children's teeth and pressed them in one by one. No shots, no crying, only ideological efficiency. Portraits of the Goebbels children were a regular feature of visual propaganda. Their smiling, blonde, disciplined faces graced magazines, school bulletins, and exhibitions. They represented the future of the Reich. That these same faces were erased by their parents reveals the core of the Nazi delusion. The Aryan ideal only made sense within the system. Outside of it, it didn't deserve to exist. Göring, the marshal of vices and the cult of spectacle. While other Nazi leaders hid their inner contradictions, Hermann Göring displayed them almost ostentatiously, turning his life into a Baroque spectacle where addiction, fetishism, and theatricality functioned as substitutes for a sexuality seemingly atrophied by its own excesses. Unlike the ascetic image cultivated by other hierarchs, Göring publicly embraced extravagance. His 1935 wedding to actress Emmy Sonnemann exemplified this tendency. A lavish ceremony with an imperial carriage, a full-dress uniform covered in decorations, and Hitler as the main witness. The celebration took place at Karinhall, his palatial residence in the Schorfheide forest, designed as a Teutonic version of Versailles. However, this essentially staged marriage concealed an intimate relationship marked by emotional distance. Emmy functioned more as a piece in Göring's personal imperial theatre than as a genuine companion. She played the role of symbolic first lady at diplomatic events while stoically accepting her husband's eccentricities and addictions in exchange for material privileges and social status. The root of many of Göring's dysfunctions can be traced back to 1923 when he was shot in the groin during the failed Munich Putsch. The physical after effects caused him chronic pain, for which doctors prescribed morphine. Thus began a dependency that would follow him for more than 2 decades, radically transforming his personality and sexual behavior. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, he consumed increasing doses of paracodyne and eucodal, opiate derivatives. His personality underwent a grotesque metamorphosis. The former flying ace became an obese, emotionally unstable figure, alternating between bouts of manic euphoria and deep depression. His judgment became erratic, and his once intimidating presence began to provoke ridicule even within the Nazi inner circle. His public appearances were beginning to resemble theatrical performances. His moods changed as quickly as his attire. One day he could be authoritarian and violent, and the next ridiculously bombastic or sentimental. The cameras of the propaganda ministry were instructed to film him only from certain angles, and his wardrobe was selected based on criteria of stage impact rather than official protocol. Göring's most distinctive characteristic was his extraordinary obsession with clothing and appearance. He owned a collection of more than 30 customized uniforms, many designed exclusively with imported fabrics, gold buttons, ermine capes, and plumed hats. He changed his outfit several times a day, depending on the occasion, with ensembles he himself described as embodiments of the Germanic spirit. This behavior transcended the merely theatrical and entered fetish territory. Clothing functioned not only as a symbol of power, but also as a symbolic substitute for conventional eroticism. Her sexuality, according to testimonies from those close to her, seemed to have progressively atrophied due to her opiate addiction, being replaced by an almost erotic fascination with uniforms, decorations, and ornaments. The accumulation of objects was not simply a sign of greed. For Göring, every piece, from a medal to a ceremonial staff, had sensory value. He enjoyed stroking them, sorting them by color or weight, and observing their shine in the light of his private rooms. Some visitors reported that he spent hours locked in his dressing room, surrounded by mirrors, adjusting insignia in front of his own reflection. Allied intelligence reports and even rumors among party members mentioned occasional cross-dressing at private meetings, where Göring allegedly disguised himself in elaborate female attire. Although these practices were never photographically documented, multiple independent testimonies point to covert paraphilias among the Reich Marshal. Emmy, his wife, reportedly tolerated these eccentricities with ceremonial coldness. According to some diplomatic sources, she slept in separate rooms and rarely spoke to him outside of official appearances. Her role was closer to that of an actress assigned to a role than that of a royal spouse. Outwardly, they both supported the wedding scene, but inside the palace, each played out their own script alone. His Hall residence served as a physical extension of these tendencies. There, he amassed one of the most extensive collections of stolen art during the war, including masterpieces by Rembrandt, Van Gogh, and Rubens. Each piece simultaneously represented a trophy of power and an object of almost carnal aesthetic desire. His compulsive accumulation of art, jewelry, luxury cars, and artifacts responded to an emotional void he sought to fill with material possessions. Hall wasn't a house, it was an altar. The works were arranged according to sensory preferences, colors, textures, framing. Göring wasn't a collector, but an erotic spectator of symbolic power. He walked the halls like a Roman emperor among captured gods. The stolen art didn't admire him. It possessed it, dominated it, subordinated it to his constant need for validation. For Göring, political power was not simply a means of implementing ideology, but a form of almost orgasmic personal satisfaction. Domination over others, executions ordered with bureaucratic coldness, and the public adulation he demanded were substitutes for a conventional sexuality he seemed incapable of experiencing. His masculinity, frustrated at the intimate level, was projected through the brutal exercise of state control. Göring's theatricality was inseparable from his sexual drive. Military parades, diplomatic receptions, and dinners at Hall were staged for the stage. Everything was choreographed to reinforce his image as an aesthetic dominator. Even his obesity, far from being a weakness, was treated as an imperial attribute. He had himself photographed in throne-like poses with carved canes and embroidered suits, as if his physical bulk were proof of virile excess. During the Nuremberg trials, with his captors withdrawing his morphine, Göring experienced renewed mental clarity. He participated lucidly in his defense and manipulated the courtroom with astonishing rhetorical skill. Sentenced to death for crimes against humanity, he performed a final act of theatrical control. He committed suicide with a cyanide capsule hidden among his belongings the night before his scheduled execution. Bormann, the secret architect of Nazi polygamy. Unlike other prominent figures of the Third Reich, Martin Bormann operated in the shadows. As Hitler's personal secretary and head of the NSDAP chancellery, he wielded his influence by controlling access to the Führer and overseeing internal party loyalty. This public discretion contrasted with his radical domestic approach, an experimental model of the Nazi family where polygamy was justified as a eugenic tool in the service of the Reich. His marriage in 1929 to Gerda Buch, daughter of the Nazi Party's highest judge, initially seemed to fit the ideal National Socialist model. Gerda perfectly embodied the feminine prototype exalted by propaganda, a prolific mother, devoted homemaker, and fervent party supporter. Between 1930 and 1943, she had 10 children with Bormann and received the Golden Cross of the German Mother, the highest decoration awarded to women for their demographic contribution to the nation. However, far from representing traditional values, Gerda developed an extreme interpretation of Nazi racial ideology that led her to radical concepts about sexuality and family. For her, the female body fundamentally represented a biological resource at the service of the state, and traditional monogamy was an unacceptable limitation on Aryan demographic expansion. This vision manifested itself concretely in 1940 when Bormann met Manja Behrens, a young German actress. He immediately developed an obsession with her, visiting her frequently and sending her extravagant gifts. What in any conventional context would have caused a marital crisis, in this case led to an extraordinary proposal from Goethe to integrate Manja into family life as a de facto second wife. According to documented accounts from domestic staff, Goethe proposed a rotating system of pregnancies. 1 year Manja has a child, the next I have it, so the Reich wins every time he enters our bed. This proposal revealed how racial ideology had completely replaced any traditional conceptions of marriage, fidelity, or exclusive love. Goethe even drew up an informal document, a kind of domestic contract, granting Manja rights similar to those of a legitimate wife in terms of financial support and status within the household, provided she fulfilled her reproductive duty to the Reich. The text, which was not officially signed but was preserved by the home's staff, established specific logistical provisions: separate bedrooms, childcare schedules, distribution of resources, and rules of discretion for public visits. The family was structured as a productive, not an emotional unit. In 1944, in the midst of the war crisis, Gerda Bormann went a step further. She formally proposed the legalization of polygamy within the Nazi legal system. Her argument combined demographic pragmatism with racial justification. With millions of German soldiers killed at the front, the Aryan birth rate faced existential danger. Why limit the reproductive capacity of racially valuable men to a single wife? The proposal, submitted to the Ministry of the Interior but never implemented due to the imminent collapse of the regime, suggested allowing up to 2 legal wives for men of superior Aryan blood, even contemplating formal procedures where both women would have to sign a declaration of loyalty and reproductive readiness. The document was accompanied by comparative statistics. Goethe argued that a properly managed polygamous family could double the birth rate of a monogamous unit without requiring additional state resources. The proposal included models of cohabitation, inheritance structures, and division of domestic tasks adapted to a racialized system. Although Hitler never officially commented on this initiative, Bormann discussed it with Himmler, whose Lebensborn program already promoted extramarital relationships for eugenic purposes. For certain SS officers, the proposal seemed consistent with the regime's racial logic, representing a natural extension of its demographic policies. Goethe and Manja's cohabitation has been documented by multiple witnesses from the domestic environment. The 2 women cohabited alternately, sharing household responsibilities according to a quasi-administrative system. The family dynamic showed no signs of jealousy or emotional disputes. It functioned as a biological production unit where each member fulfilled an assigned role. A servant identified as Ilse R. later stated, "It wasn't a normal household, it was like a uniformed human farm. Everything was in the line of duty." This structured coldness directly reflected the Nazi view of the individual as a mere instrument in the service of collective racial goals. The Bormann household was not an exception, but a pilot experiment. Goethe corresponded with other wives of party officials, sharing advice on fertility, child-rearing routines, and even methods for promoting racial purity in nutrition. For them, the body was a civic responsibility and motherhood a form of ideological loyalty. Bormann did not limit this instrumental view of human relations to the domestic sphere. From his influential position, he actively encouraged loyal officials to have numerous children, even out of wedlock, with women considered racially suitable. In an internal memo, he wrote, "Valuable blood should not be wasted on bourgeois moralizing," summarizing his disdain for traditional moral constraints when they hindered demographic objectives. He even drafted proposals for a birth bonus reserved for high-ranking party officials, awarded for each child conceived within or outside of marriage with certified Aryan women. The scheme was outlined, discussed in confidential circles, and shelved without formal approval in the face of the military collapse of the Reich. After the fall of Berlin in May 1945, Bormann disappeared while attempting to flee. For decades, speculation swirled about his possible escape to South America, until his remains were identified near Lehrte station in 1972, confirming his death during the final days of the Reich. Gerda Bormann died shortly after the war, suffering from cancer in an Italian hospital. Her children were separated and raised by different German families. Paradoxically, one of them, Martin Bormann Jr., became a Catholic priest dedicated to denouncing Nazi crimes, seeking reconciliation with his father's terrible legacy. The Bormann family experiment illustrates how Nazi racial ideology aspired to reconfigure even the most fundamental human institutions, replacing traditional emotional bonds with functional structures serving state biopolitical objectives. Hess, the fanatic who loved Hitler. Among all the Nazi leaders, Rudolf Hess represents the most extraordinary case of sexual sublimation through political fanaticism. His relationship with Hitler transcended conventional loyalty to manifest itself as a form of almost religious devotion that replaced and channeled emotional and physical impulses that would normally be expressed in traditional intimate relationships. Shy, introverted, and deeply mystical, Hess shadowed Hitler for years like a silent shadow. Unlike figures like Goebbels or Göring, he sought no personal prominence or material gratification. His existence seemed completely subsumed within the figure of the Führer, to the point that he signed documents as eternally his, and referred to Hitler not as a political leader but as a spiritual guide and savior of Germany. In 1927, he married Ilse Pröll, a young woman from a wealthy Berlin family and a fervent National Socialist. Hitler himself intervened in the union, taking Ilse's hand during a dinner and placing it in Hess's as he formally proposed marriage. Neither of them could refuse the Führer's suggestion. The most extraordinary aspect of this union was its fundamentally asexual nature. According to documented historical accounts, they did not consummate their marriage during the first 7 years of their marriage. Ilse confessed to a close friend that she felt like a novice in a convent rather than a wife. Physical contact was minimal or non-existent, while Hess devoted his energies to personal rituals of fidelity to Hitler. Ilse's personal records, though scant, describe a solitary domestic life. She slept alone, spent entire days without exchanging a word with her husband, and was excluded from party social circles. Her role was decorative and subordinate, a wife without a conjugal role or real place within the political apparatus. Only in 1937, 10 years after the wedding, did the couple have a son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess. Even this event seems to have been more an act of ideological fulfillment than an expression of natural desire. After conception, Hess quickly returned to his self-imposed celibacy, as if sexuality represented a distraction from his true mission: to serve the Führer unconditionally. During his years as Hitler's official lieutenant, Hess developed behaviors that baffled even by the standards of the Nazi personality cult. He designed private rituals of submission where he would light candles, recited oaths of allegiance, and occasionally weep with emotion in Hitler's presence. He kept the Führer's personal belongings as sacred relics and kept a diary in which he obsessively recorded every interaction with him. In his office, there was a small altar with a bust of Hitler, flanked by table torches. He lit incense, wrote reflections, recited excerpts from Mein Kampf as if they were scriptures, and wore a separate ceremonial jacket for these occasions. He did not allow anyone to enter while performing these acts. Psychiatrist Gustav Gilbert, who interviewed Nazi leaders during the Nuremberg trials, described Hess as a completely dependent personality, whose identity had been dissolved within the figure of Hitler. He spoke not of conventional politics, but of fulfilling the divine mission entrusted to him by the Führer. The intensity of this devotion, combined with his apparent indifference to normative sexual relations, generated persistent rumors about his sexual orientation. He was disparagingly referred to as Fräulein Hess, or the Führer's lady-in-waiting, by some party members. The fact that he occasionally shared a room with Hitler during the early years of the movement intensified these speculations. There is no evidence of a physical homosexual relationship between the two, and most historians consider Hess to have been more likely asexual than homosexual. However, his emotional connection with Hitler displayed characteristics that some analysts have described as political romanticism, a connection where ideological admiration takes on dimensions of absolute personal devotion that replaces conventional romantic ties. The very language Hess used reinforced this interpretation. In private letters, he wrote phrases like, "My life is not mine, but yours," or "fulfillment is only given to me in your presence." He never used the word love, but his entire discourse was laden with terms of belonging, need, and mystical elevation. In public speeches, Hess would refer to Hitler with phrases like, "When the Führer enters the room, the darkness disappears. His voice is light. His word is our salvation." This language, more akin to religious experience than political loyalty, revealed an emotional connection that transcended the normal hierarchical structures of the party. Hitler, for his part, showed unusual tolerance and consideration toward Hess. He was one of the few people he allowed to share the familiarities he rejected from others. This fueled rumors within Nazi circles, where figures such as Goebbels and Göring viewed this privileged relationship with suspicion, gradually sabotaging Hess's influence. Bormann, in particular, maneuvered to oust him, considering him weak, ridiculous, and emotionally unstable. Internal documents show how he limited his access to Hitler and minimized his role in the party, while encouraging ridicule among the middle ranks to undermine his image. When Hitler began to distance himself from him in the late 1930s, favoring Martin Bormann as his personal secretary, Hess experienced a severe psychological crisis. He developed chronic insomnia, lost weight dramatically, and displayed increasingly erratic behavior. What for others would have been simple political marginalization, for Hess represented a devastating existential rejection. This crisis culminated in the most disconcerting episode of his career. On May 10, 1941, he piloted a Messerschmitt Bf 110 alone toward Scotland, apparently intending to negotiate peace with Great Britain on his own initiative. Hitler reacted by declaring him mentally disturbed and stripping him of all his posts. Although the exact motivations for this suicide mission remain debated, many historians interpret it as a desperate attempt to regain Hitler's favor through an extraordinary heroic gesture. He did not seek to betray the Führer, but rather to impress him with a bold initiative that would demonstrate his irreplaceable courage. In his statement to the British authorities, Hess did not make any specific demands. He spoke of a peace mission, a spiritual duty, and personal sacrifice for German truth. His narrative lacked strategic objectives, reinforcing the perception that the gesture was driven by emotional, not rational necessity. Captured by the British, Hess spent the rest of the war as a prisoner and was later sentenced to life imprisonment in Nuremberg. For decades, he was the only high-ranking Nazi prisoner at Spandau, living in almost total isolation until his death in 1987. At the age of 93, under circumstances some consider suspicious. What makes Hess's case extraordinary is how Nazi doctrine, with its cult of the Führer, provided a socially acceptable channel for sublimating emotional impulses that in other contexts would have been expressed through conventional romantic ties. Her devotion to Hitler, which completely replaced her marital and sexual life, represents perhaps the most extreme way in which National Socialist ideology colonized and deformed the intimate dimension of its followers. When asked at Nuremberg why he continued to defend Hitler in the face of evidence of his crimes, he replied simply, "I swore loyalty, and loyalty is for eternity." This phrase encapsulates the essence of a life where ideological fanaticism had completely replaced any other fundamental human connection.